because Mike thought they was gonna convict him. And he says, Steve, I didn't do this, man. I just believed him.
For decades, the world has heard countless stories about Michael Jackson, the fame, the genius, the controversies, and the mystery surrounding his life. But now, at 69, Steve Harvey is finally opening up about what he witnessed. From moments few people ever saw to the truth about Michael's personality, Harvey's revelations are surprising fans everywhere. Was Michael misunderstood? What was he like when the spotlight disappeared? Join us in this video as we dive into Steve Harvey's thoughts, stories, and the shocking truth he says people never understood about the king of pop. Steve Harvey finally reveals what Michael Jackson told him. The crisis that changed everything for Michael Jackson began in February 2003, when Martin Bashir's documentary Living with Michael Jackson aired on television. Millions of people around the world were watching that night, including Steve Harvey, who was sitting at home in Los Angeles expecting to see Michael finally tell his side of the story. But before the documentary had even finished airing, Steve's phone rang. It was Michael, and he was crying. "I've never heard a grown man sound so broken," Steve would later admit, still shaken by the memory years afterward. He kept saying, "They tricked me, Steve. I trusted him. I let him into my home, into my life, and he tricked me." What stood out to Steve wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. Michael sounded devastated, completely blindsided, like someone who had just realized the world was about to turn against him again. For Michael, the documentary was never supposed to become a scandal. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Martin Bashir, a respected British journalist at the time, had spent months following Michael around, filming private moments at Neverland Ranch, sitting with him during emotional conversations, and gaining access almost nobody else had ever received. Michael believed people would finally see the real him. The cameras captured him with his children, walking through Neverland, talking openly about his lonely childhood, his career, his fears, and his love for helping sick children. For once, Michael thought he was being understood instead of mocked. Instead, according to Steve, the final documentary painted a completely different picture. Bashir's editing and narration made Michael appear strange, unstable, and dangerous. The most controversial moment came when Michael spoke about sharing his bedroom with children, including a young cancer patient named Gavin Arvizo. Michael explained that he often gave children the bed while he slept on the floor, seeing it as an act of kindness and comfort. But the documentary didn't present the moment with sympathy. It presented it with suspicion. The narration carried a tone that made viewers uncomfortable. And within hours, the backlash exploded worldwide. Steve said Michael immediately understood what was coming next. "He called me in a panic," Steve recalled, not because he was guilty of something, but because he knew how the media worked. He knew once they picked a story, facts didn't matter anymore. And sadly, Michael's fears became reality. Only weeks later, the Arvizo family, the same family Michael had supported during their son's illness, accused him of misconduct. Suddenly, the documentary wasn't just entertainment anymore. It became the spark that ignited one of the most public legal battles in celebrity history. The man leading the investigation was Santa Barbara District Attorney Tom Snedon, the same prosecutor who had unsuccessfully pursued Michael years earlier in the 1993 allegations. This time, according to Steve, the pressure surrounding Michael felt even more intense. And during that period, Michael told Steve something he says he never forgot. "Michael looked at me and said, 'Steve, they don't want justice. They want me destroyed.'" Steve paused while remembering the conversation. Then he said, "Not just my career. They want me humiliated, erased, because I'm too successful, too powerful, too black, and too different to play by their rules." Steve admitted that some people might hear those words and think Michael was paranoid. Others might say he was trying to make himself a victim. But Steve insists that after witnessing everything that happened afterward, he no longer saw those comments as paranoia. He saw them as predictions. In November 2003, authorities raided Neverland Ranch with a massive police operation. Officers searched the property while helicopters circled overhead and cameras waited outside the gates. News footage of investigators walking through Michael's private rooms instantly spread across television networks around the world. To Steve, the entire thing felt humiliating on purpose. The images were everywhere, he said. It was like they wanted the world to see Michael brought down. During that time, Michael stopped trusting most people. According to Steve, he became isolated and emotionally exhausted. But somehow, Michael still reached out to him. He didn't want many people around, Steve explained, but I think he trusted me because I never treated him like a superstar. I never wanted anything from him. I was just his friend. A few days after the raid, Steve visited Neverland. What he saw shocked him. The ranch that was normally full of music, laughter, and activity felt empty and lifeless. Many staff members had already been sent home. The amusement rides sat completely still. The energy that once made the place feel magical was gone. And then Steve saw Michael. He looked smaller, Steve remembered. He'd lost weight. His face looked tired. His eyes looked hollow. But one detail stayed with Steve more than anything else. His hands were shaking. This was the same man who had performed in front of stadiums packed with screaming fans. The same performer whose dance moves changed music forever. Yet now, Steve said, Michael couldn't even hold a cup of coffee steady. The two men sat together for hours. Michael walked Steve through everything. The accusations, the timelines, the inconsistencies in the stories being told about him, and the fear that his entire life was collapsing in front of him. But according to Steve, one question kept coming up again and again. Why do they hate me so much? Steve says that question was real. Michael genuinely wanted to understand. That's what people never understood, Steve explained. Michael wasn't asking for sympathy. He honestly couldn't figure out why people hated him with so much intensity. In Michael's mind, he had spent his life trying to make people happy. Through music, charity work, and helping sick children, he believed he was putting love into the world. Yet somehow, the world now saw him as a monster. Then came a moment Steve says he can never forget. While they were sitting in the kitchen talking, Michael's young son Prince walked into the room. At the time, he was only around 6 years old. The little boy looked at his father innocently and asked, "Daddy, why do people on TV say bad things about you?" Steve said the question shattered Michael instantly. I watched his face completely fall apart, Steve remembered emotionally. Michael knelt down, hugged his son tightly, and softly told him, "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand, but the truth will come out." Prince eventually left the room, and the second he did, Michael lowered his head into his hands and started crying. For Steve Harvey, a man famous for jokes, laughter, and always finding humor even during difficult situations, there was nothing funny about that moment. I sat there thinking about my own kids, Steve admitted. I thought about how painful it would be to explain to them why the world believed terrible things about their father. I couldn't imagine carrying that kind of weight. But despite the pain, Steve also witnessed something surprising that day. He witnessed Michael's determination. After breaking down emotionally, Michael eventually looked back up at Steve and said something that stayed with him forever. "I'm going to fight this," Michael told him. "Not just for me, but for my children. Because if I let people destroy me without fighting back, what lesson does that teach them? That you should stay silent when people lie about you? That you should give up?" That was the moment, Steve says, when he truly understood Michael Jackson's strength. "The world saw somebody weak," Steve explained. "They saw somebody strange, somebody fragile. But I saw a man being attacked from every direction, betrayed by people he trusted, facing prison, public humiliation, and the possibility of losing everything." Then Steve paused before finishing his thought, and somehow he still refused to completely break. "That," Steve said quietly, "is real strength." But what really happened during Michael Jackson's terrifying courtroom nightmare afterward? Keep watching to find out. Inside Michael Jackson's darkest courtroom battle. When the trial of Michael Jackson officially began in January 2005,
jurors in the Michael Jackson trial begin their first day of deliberations this morning. It follows a return trip to the hospital by Jackson.
the entire world seemed to stop and watch. For 5 long months, the courthouse in Santa Maria, California, became the center of non-stop media chaos. News vans lined the streets before sunrise. Reporters fought for updates every single day. Crowds gathered outside carrying signs, cameras, and opinions about a man many had already judged before the trial even started. According to Steve Harvey, it felt less like a legal case and more like a public execution. Every morning, Michael had to walk through screaming crowds just to enter the courthouse. Fans cried for him. Protesters shouted against him. Photographers chased every expression on his face. Every movement became headline news. People weren't just watching the trial, they were watching Michael himself. The media analyzed everything. The way he walked, the way he dressed, the way he spoke, even the way he looked at people in the courtroom. His entire life was being pulled apart on live television. Steve stayed close to Michael during that period, even though Michael specifically asked him not to attend the court proceedings in person. He didn't want me connected to it, Steve explained later. He was trying to protect me. And to Steve, that said everything about Michael's character. Here he was fighting for his freedom, fighting for his name, and somehow he was still worried about other people getting hurt because of him. Even from a distance, Steve followed the trial obsessively. He watched the news coverage, studied court transcripts, and spoke directly with people connected to Michael's legal team. And the more he learned, the more disturbed he became. Because according to Steve, what the public was hearing outside the courtroom looked completely different from what was actually happening inside it. The prosecution's case was falling apart, Steve said bluntly. Witnesses were reportedly contradicting themselves. Timelines changed. Stories shifted under cross-examination. The credibility of the Arvizo family was taking serious damage, as defense attorneys pointed out inconsistencies in their claims and past behavior. There was no physical evidence, Steve explained. No proof, no solid corroboration, just accusations. But despite that, the media narrative barely changed. Television coverage continued focusing on Michael's appearance, his eccentric personality, and moments that made him seem unstable in the public eye. One day, headlines exploded after Michael arrived late to court wearing pajama bottoms because of severe back pain and medication following a hospital visit. Instead of sympathy, he became a punchline. Courtroom sketches exaggerated his appearance. Commentators mocked him nightly on television. Late-night comedians turned the trial into entertainment. To Steve, it felt like the verdict had already been decided by the public long before the jury ever reached deliberations. The story had already been written, he said. Michael Jackson was guilty in people's minds, and the trial was just there to make it official. But during the middle of the case, Steve finally decided to ask Michael the question that had been weighing heavily on him. One night, he called him directly. I asked him point blank, Steve remembered. Michael, tell me the truth. Did you do any of this? Then came silence. Not a quick pause. A long silence. Steve said it felt like Michael was gathering himself emotionally before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Steve, Michael said softly, I have never harmed a child. Not in thought, not in word, not in deed. Then he added something Steve says he never forgot. I would rather die than hurt a child. Steve believed him, not because he was blinded by fame, not because he was a loyal fan, but because of everything he had personally witnessed over the years. I'd seen Michael around children, Steve explained. I watched how he interacted with them. It never felt sexual. It never felt predatory. What Steve saw instead was someone emotionally stuck between adulthood and childhood. Someone trying to recreate the innocence he felt had been stolen from him growing up inside the brutal machine of fame. It was unusual, Steve admitted, but unusual doesn't mean criminal. That distinction, Steve believed, was something much of the world refused to consider. Finally, after months of testimony, arguments, and relentless media attention, the verdict day arrived on June 13, 2005. This time, Michael asked Steve to come. Not directly into the courtroom, but nearby. I think he just needed to know somebody who believed him was close, Steve said. The tension that day was unbearable. Cameras crowded every entrance. Thousands of fans and reporters waited outside the courthouse for history to be made. Then the jury returned. Not guilty. Not guilty on all 14 counts. Inside the courtroom, Michael's family broke down emotionally. Supporters outside erupted into celebration. Around the world, fans cried tears of relief. But when Steve finally saw Michael afterward, he noticed something strange. Michael didn't look victorious. He looked exhausted, drained. Steve expected relief, maybe even happiness. Instead, Michael quietly looked at him and said something that would stay with Steve forever. "We won," he said softly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But I lost everything anyway." After so many years later, why did Steve Harvey finally decide to speak out? Stay tuned to find out. Why Steve Harvey finally revealed the truth. For nearly 20 years, Steve Harvey stayed quiet about Michael Jackson. He watched the documentaries. He watched the interviews. He watched the endless arguments about whether Michael was innocent or guilty. And through all of it, he said almost nothing publicly. Even in 2019, when HBO released Leaving Neverland and reignited worldwide debate around the allegations against Michael,
we need to talk about this Michael Jackson documentary. Last night, HBO aired the second part of their Leaving Neverland documentary. The documentary's airing was followed by an after show hosted by the one and only Oprah Winfrey.
Steve still refused to speak. Friends encouraged him to share what he knew. Fans constantly asked for his perspective. But according to Steve, he wasn't ready. "I made a promise to myself," he explained. "I said I wouldn't talk about Michael until I was prepared to tell the whole truth, not just the pieces people wanted to hear." For years, Steve says he carried anger over what he had witnessed happen to Michael. He struggled with the way the world reduced such a complicated human being into headlines, accusations, and tabloid narratives. But something changed recently. At 69 years old, Steve says he began thinking differently about life, death, and the stories people leave behind after they're gone. "I buried my father."
My father died when I was 43. Casket was open. I was looking at the coldest dude I ever met. How would I have ever made it without that dude? A young boy without a father figure is like an explorer without a map.
"I've lost friends. You start thinking about legacy when you get older," he admitted. "And I kept thinking about Michael, about how people who never really knew him are still controlling his story." Steve said the final push came from an unexpected moment with his granddaughter. One day, she came home from school upset after hearing Michael Jackson discussed negatively in class. According to Steve, the conversation painted Michael as nothing more than a scandalized celebrity surrounded by accusations. Then she asked him a question he said hit him harder than anything else. "Papa Steve, was Michael Jackson a bad man?" Steve's voice reportedly cracked while remembering the moment. "And that's when it hit me," he said. "An entire generation is growing up hearing only one version of the story. Not opinions, not debates, but what Steve firmly believes are distortions and incomplete narratives. I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore." Still, Steve understands the backlash that comes with defending someone as controversial as Michael Jackson. He knows many people will immediately reject anything that challenges what they already believe. "I know exactly what people are going to say," Steve admitted. "They'll say I'm defending a predator. They'll say I'm blind, naive, or part of the problem." But at this stage of his life, Steve says he no longer cares about protecting his image. "I'd rather be criticized for standing beside someone I believed was innocent than stay quiet while his entire legacy gets buried." But according to Steve, the real story of Michael Jackson goes far beyond courtrooms and allegations. To him, Michael represented something much bigger. Michael was like a mirror, Steve explained thoughtfully. He reflected back everything society claims to admire: love, generosity, innocence, creativity, kindness. Then Steve paused before adding, "And society destroyed him for it." According to Steve, people often say they want goodness and compassion in the world, but fame changes how those qualities are viewed. "We say we want kind people," he said, "but deep down, people are more entertained by scandal, more comfortable with cynicism. We love building people up, then tearing them apart once they shine too brightly." Steve also pointed to facts he believes are often ignored whenever Michael's story is discussed publicly. He noted that Michael Jackson faced years of intense investigation by law enforcement, including federal scrutiny and extensive searches of Neverland Ranch. Every computer, every hard drive, every room, every piece of property was examined, Steve said. This was probably the most investigated entertainer in modern history. And according to Steve, despite all of that scrutiny, no physical evidence was ever found proving criminal misconduct. But that doesn't make headlines the same way accusations do, he added. Steve also expressed frustration that many younger people know far more about the allegations than they do about Michael's humanitarian work. This man donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charity during his lifetime, Steve said passionately. He supported dozens of organizations around the world. Michael Jackson was widely recognized for supporting children's hospitals, medical research, disaster relief, and educational programs across multiple countries. He helped sick children constantly, Steve continued. He funded scholarships. He visited hospitals quietly without cameras around. But somehow, that part of his life barely gets talked about anymore. Then Steve pointed out something else that deeply frustrates him. According to him, many of the same industries that mocked or profited from Michael's downfall are still making money from his image today. The same culture that called him a freak is now cashing in on his music, his documentaries, his legacy, Steve said. People who never defended him are still benefiting from what he created. But Steve believes this conversation is ultimately about more than just Michael Jackson himself. To him, it reflects a much larger issue involving fame, race, power, and public perception in America. What happened to Michael wasn't unique, Steve argued. It's part of a pattern. He pointed to other influential black public figures throughout history who faced public backlash after challenging powerful systems or refusing to stay within expectations placed on them. Steve referenced athletes, entertainers, and activists who were criticized, financially threatened, or publicly attacked after gaining major influence. When black people become too powerful, too wealthy, too independent, there's often pressure to tear them down, he said. Steve specifically mentioned figures like Muhammad Ali and Jack Johnson, who publicly fought against systems they believed exploited artists and public figures. The methods may look different, Steve explained, but the message stays the same. Remind them who controls the system. One thing that still angers Steve most is the role he believes the media played in shaping public perception of Michael. Journalism is supposed to search for truth, he said. But a lot of what happened to Michael wasn't journalism anymore. It was character destruction. According to Steve, Michael's soft-spoken personality, unusual appearance, and eccentric behavior were constantly framed in the darkest possible way. Everything about him became suspicious, Steve said. His voice, his appearance, his kindness toward children, the media turned every unusual thing about him into evidence of guilt. And Steve believes that culture has only become more extreme over time. We live in a world now where accusations alone can define someone forever, he said. Nuance disappears, context disappears. You're either completely innocent or completely evil. Then Steve made one final observation that continues to stay with audiences. Michael Jackson was one of the first people modern cancel culture truly consumed, he said quietly. They destroyed him publicly. And after that, they learned they could do it to almost anyone. After everything he survived, what did Michael Jackson truly want most? Let's find out. The day Michael Jackson just wanted peace. According to Steve Harvey, one of the most emotional moments he ever shared with Michael Jackson happened during the height of Michael's legal troubles. Steve said Michael called him one day and quietly said, "Man, I just want to go to church." Michael believed he might be convicted, and Steve could hear the fear in his voice. "Steve, I didn't do this," Michael told him. Steve said he believed him completely because of the years they had spent together. So Steve arranged for Michael to attend a church service in Los Angeles quietly.
ABC News accompanied Michael Jackson for a rare public appearance as he joined Sunday worshipers at Los Angeles' first AME church.
But before leaving, Steve joked about Michael's flashy military-style outfit, laughing, "Man, you dressed like Captain Crunch. We going to church, not a parade." Michael laughed too. For a brief moment, things felt normal again. But once they arrived near the church, the streets were packed with thousands of fans. People had flown in from countries around the world just to see Michael attend service. Steve looked over at him in disbelief. Even during the darkest moment of his life, Michael Jackson still drew the entire world toward him. Long before fame, where did Michael Jackson's painful journey begin? Keep watching to find out. From Gary, Indiana, to the edge of greatness. Long before Michael Jackson became the king of pop, before the sold-out stadiums, the screaming crowds, and the worldwide fame, he was just a little boy growing up in a cramped house in Gary, Indiana. In the late 1950s, Gary was a rough steel town filled with smoke, factory noise, and hard-working families trying to survive. At 2300 Jackson Street, 11 members of the Jackson family lived together inside a tiny home with only 2 small bedrooms. That house was where Michael Jackson was born on August 29, 1958. Life there was far from glamorous. Money was tight, space was limited, privacy barely existed. But inside that crowded home, something extraordinary was beginning to grow. Michael's father, Joseph Jackson, worked long hours at a steel mill, but music was his real obsession. He believed his children had talent, especially Michael, whose natural rhythm and voice stood out even at a very young age. Determined to turn that talent into success, Joseph formed what would eventually become the Jackson 5. But the discipline inside the Jackson household was intense. According to Michael's later interviews and his memoir, Moonwalk, rehearsals were strict and mistakes were punished harshly. Michael described living in fear of his father's temper. If the boys missed dance steps or sang the wrong notes, Joseph often responded with belts, shouting, or humiliation. Some of the deepest wounds weren't physical. Michael later revealed that his father constantly criticized his appearance, especially his nose, leaving emotional scars that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The fear became so severe that Michael admitted he sometimes felt physically sick whenever Joseph entered the room. While other children played outside after school, Michael's childhood quickly disappeared into rehearsals, performances, and recording sessions. By the age of 8, he was already working professionally. The Jackson 5 traveled across the Midwest, performing in clubs, talent shows, and venues that were often completely inappropriate for children. Some performances even took place in adult nightclubs and strip clubs late at night. While Michael and his brothers watched grown-up behavior they were far too young to understand. The audience saw adorable young performers, but behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. Then came the turning point that changed everything. In 1968, the Jackson 5 caught the attention of Berry Gordy, the legendary founder of Motown. Gordy immediately recognized the group's enormous commercial potential and signed them to the label. Soon after, the entire Jackson family moved to California. Almost overnight, their lives changed forever. Under Motown, the Jackson 5 exploded into worldwide fame. Their first 4 major singles, including I Want You Back, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There, all reached #1 on the Billboard charts. It was a historic achievement. The group became one of the biggest sensations in music, and at the center of it all was young Michael. His energy, charisma, dancing, and voice separated him from everyone else. Audiences around the world fell in love with him. But according to Michael, success came with a painful cost. While millions of fans saw fame and excitement, Michael experienced isolation. He later admitted that he never truly understood what childhood was supposed to feel like. Instead of birthday parties, school events, or hanging out with friends, his life revolved around touring, recording, interviews, and constant public attention. The studio became his classroom. The stage became his playground. And loneliness became normal. Despite being surrounded by screaming fans and family members, Michael often felt emotionally alone. That loneliness slowly shaped the quiet, sensitive personality the world would later struggle to understand. By the mid-1970s, the popularity of the Jackson 5 started slowing down as the brothers grew older. Michael, now entering adulthood, began wanting more creative freedom. He no longer wanted to exist only as part of a family act. He wanted to become his own artist. That opportunity arrived in 1978 when Michael starred as the Scarecrow in The Wiz, a reimagined version of The Wizard of Oz featuring a mostly black cast. And during the production of that film, Michael met the man who would completely change his future, Quincy Jones. Quincy immediately recognized something special in Michael beyond what the public already saw. He didn't just see a former child star, he saw genius. The two formed a creative partnership that would eventually reshape modern music forever. Under Quincy's guidance, Michael began recording his solo album Off the Wall in late 1978. The album became a massive success and laid the foundation for what was coming next. To the world, the Jackson 5 story looked like a dream come true. But for Michael, parts of it felt like a prison he had spent his entire life trying to escape. And soon, he was about to break free in the biggest way imaginable. Michael Jackson didn't just want success anymore. He wanted transformation. He wanted complete artistic control. He wanted to become something the world had never seen before. And he did. What do you think about Steve Harvey's revelation? Let us know in the comments section below. In the end, this was never just about rumors, courtrooms, or headlines surrounding Michael Jackson. It was about a man the world thought it knew, and a friend who finally decided to speak after years of silence. Through all the fame, controversy, and pain, Steve Harvey believes the real Michael Jackson was far more human, far more wounded, and far more misunderstood than people ever realized. Whether you agree or disagree, one thing is undeniable. Michael's story still sparks emotion decades later. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories behind the world's most iconic figures.